Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be among you. I do want to recognize first, coming from the source of the particular event, but coming here at this time and thinking about the special relationship that we've talked about all these years, and something about that is really manifested in the effort that Peter Rosengard came to us about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was in the middle of much of our work and trying to think about what we were going to do. And this gentleman shows up and he's trying to place steel in London and have a memorial, and didn't really focus that much on it, but all of a sudden, a couple of years later, there's a memorial in London with steel. And then he comes back and he says, well, we want to do a program in the UK where we'll have competition for young students to talk about the impact of 9/11 and issues of tolerance in our country. And then a couple of years later, he comes back with a group of students, and again. And so this is something that has an enormous impact on us, because when we talk about 9/11, we speak about this global event centered in the United States, of course. 2,977 people killed in the 4 airplanes of 3 attack sites. 90 countries had citizens who died in this event. The World Trade Center had actually been built with the idea that promoting world trade would also promote peace. And so your country here actually has, after our own casualty count, the highest number of victims of 9/11. 67 people, either nationals or residents of the UK. More, in fact, than were killed on 7/7. And so we feel the ties for this. We receive many visitors from your country. And I thought in presenting today to sort of bring us back a little bit to what our job is, something about the event itself, and to talk a little bit about the issues that we face in building an institution. We're not a school, though we offer workshops and other classes for students and resources for teachers. This is all part of the issue of really trying to locate what the meaning of 9/11 is, both in terms of the event itself, but naturally going forward now 15 years later. Let me take you back to the day. This is 2 days later. Lord West mentioned before the enormous impact 9/11 had, but the event itself lasted 102 minutes, from 8:46 in the morning, when Flight 11 was flown into the north face of the North Tower, until 10:28 that morning, when the North Tower collapsed. The North Tower hit first, was actually the second of the buildings to collapse. Within that period of time, the South Tower is hit and collapses. The Pentagon is hit. And a 4th plane, which we believe was bound for the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., is seized by the passengers, or their attempt to retake control of the plane forces the terrorists to end their plot prematurely, and the plane crashes in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. 102 minutes for all of this to occur, and all of this to change the world. And it's certainly the case that 15 years later, we are still living in the shadow of that 102 minutes. Now, the view I'm showing you here of the site is roughly from south facing north. And if you look at this photograph, you will see something really extraordinary, which is a building complex that was obviously designed to the smallest detail and laid out on a grid that has completely disintegrated in the collapse. There's no sense of where the buildings were and what was there. This whole notion of a world disordered is the visual consequence of 9/11, but it was also the framing of the terrorist plot, if you will. The whole idea that what we understood as normal was in their minds criminal and therefore justifiably attacked. This is 2001. This is the site today, after the redevelopment. You see this sense of order, and the grid of what the place was has been reestablished with the design of the memorial. The 2 pools you see, this is again looking south to north. So the South Pool and the North Pool are situated within the original footprints of the World Trade Center buildings themselves. So the parapets around the pools, which bear the names of 2,977 9/11 victims, plus the 6 victims of the February 26, 1993 truck bombing, the basement level of the World Trade Center. Those names on the parapets serve to essentially frame the absence of where the buildings once stood. And that absence is now a permanent feature of this location. The small building you see between the 2 pools is the actual entrance to the museum. It doesn't look it from the building itself, but the museum is a very large space, 110,000 square feet. Most of it arrayed 7 stories below ground, below this memorial plaza, which in effect is the roof of the museum. And it allows for the visitors, when they make this descent, to actually see the surviving building elements of the World Trade Center complex. The museum is, in fact, encompassed by those surviving elements of the buildings. The museum, the memorial, which I was just showing you, serves multiple purposes, of course. Famous photograph from the front pages of our newspapers from the actual opening of the memorial on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. So it's a place, of course, of remembrance and mourning for families and communities. It's also a place of education. Education in the sense of school children coming, being brought by their teachers in groups, but also families as visitors to New York, bringing their children here and needing some explanation, some help in understanding why is it that we remember? How do we remember? What are the means of memory? And so we have developed a variety of means of exploring with particularly younger children what it means to remember and how societies organize themselves to do so. So you have mourning, you have education, and you have commemoration. Our site really does serve a national purpose. We are the National 9/11 Memorial Museum. And we receive visits from dignitaries from around the world. When the United Nations General Assembly is in session, for example, we are inundated with requests for visits. Of course, we meet them all. Prime Minister Cameron was there. Many, many others have come from your country and really from around the world. The memorial itself has received more than 30 million visitors since the 10th anniversary of 9/11. The museum, which opened on May 2014, has already received 8.25 million visitors. So this is a global place of pilgrimage and remembrance. 30%, I should say, of those visitors to the museum come from overseas. So this is not an event confined within the frontiers of the United States. This is something that was seen in real time around the world and created in that collective witness a community of witness and memory of 9/11. Just to take you briefly into the museum, that dotted line in the drawing actually describes the outline of the museum 7 stories below ground. So you can see it's situated under the footprints of the towers themselves. And that's what that design looks like at the bedrock level. We call bedrock that level 7 stories below ground. The North Tower footprint at the top of the screen contains an historical exhibition that talks about the event itself, talks about the causes or what led to 9/11, and of course the consequences which are still unfolding. In the South Tower, we have an education center, but that square in purple is actually the memorial exhibition, a separate exhibition dedicated to the 2,983 people killed in the 2 attacks on the World Trade Center and beyond. And I'll take you into that very briefly in a moment. This is sort of a cross-section of how you get down, and you really take a ramp down to the bedrock level. The ramp takes you to this overlook where you are looking into these enormous underground spaces. And this is something that has a very powerful impact on our visitors. People really don't expect, when they're going below ground, for the space to open up for them. And in fact, it's really a brilliant stroke. The architects have incorporated the volumes and the sense of scale of the World Trade Center buildings into the underground space. And so from that overlook, you really begin to understand just how much has changed, because everything that you're seeing from this overlook was part of the original 16-acre complex of the World Trade Center, those 7 stories below ground. Everything you're seeing from that overlook was filled with the debris of the collapse. And so the design, the clarity, the cleanliness, the visitation, all of that is part of the recovery. And it symbolizes, again, as Lord West said, that our lives did not change inalterably, that we remember and that we go back to this, not to be weakened, certainly to remember, but also to take strength from what we were able to overcome. And here again, the spaces of the museum at the bedrock level. Again, the scale, you're looking up at the overlook, which was in the previous photo. The exhibition begins on that ramp as you go down, September 11th, 2001. But I won't really take you into that because I don't really think we'll have the time to go into the details of what we do in the 20,000 square foot exhibition space. But I did want to bring you to a couple of places that focus on commemoration and memorialization. Now, some of you may have seen this photograph, this enormous wall, which has these 2 particular memorial markings on it. But I bring it to your attention because it highlights, in some ways, the continuing impact of 9/11, the continuing nature of unanswered questions about the event. Because the wall shields us from what is not part of a visit to the museum, but which is a core element of the assignment we were given in putting the museum together. One of the sad facts of the 9/11 attack at the World Trade Center is that to this day, 40% of the families of victims of 9/11 at the Trade Center have received no physical trace of their loved one. So roughly 40% of those victims literally disappeared. I won't dwell on the impact that that would have on families. I think we can all understand that. But we were given the mandate in taking the museum responsibility on to provide a facility for the chief medical examiner of New York, the coroner, who to this day holds a certain number of unidentified and unclaimed remains because the DNA identification work continues to this day, and identifications continue to be made, however slowly. And that facility is behind this wall. And so what we have is not simply an ordinary museum, it's a memorial museum with this specific feature to it. And so this wall was something we wanted to mark in a very particular way. The first, the inscription from Virgil's Aeneid, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." It's forged by the blacksmith artist Tom Joyce out of World Trade Center steel and was put on that wall. And then surrounding it is another installation by the New York artist Spencer Finch. It's called "Trying to Remember the Color of the Sky on That September Morning." Anybody who was in New York on that day, as I was, when they talk about it, 99% of the time people will tell you what a beautiful, crystal clear day it started out to be. The pilots call it severe clear, literally not a cloud in the sky in view. And so this memory comes back at the top of the ramp when you're walking down. We actually have a photo of that blue sky as the beginning of the story. The artist, Spencer Finch, working with this idea of the blue sky, made on that wall 2,983 unique watercolors, each in a different shade of blue. 2,983, of course, being the number of names on the memorial up above. Now, this idea of the individuality combining into the common impact and the common experience is something that is very typical of both the attack and the response to the attack. People did come together, bringing their individuality and working to some sort of collective betterment of this most horrible moment. And so Spencer's work kind of captures that. We also have this memorial exhibition nearby in which there are 2 chambers essentially. The outer chamber bears the photographs of nearly all, we're 5 or 6 short, nearly all of those 2,983 victims. So the walls, the four walls, are arrayed with faces. What you realize very quickly when you're in the room is that as much as you would want to, you cannot see all the victims. You literally cannot take them in. And what that does, of course, is it reinforces the nature of the crime, which was a mass murder. So what we wanted to do in the inner chamber was take you, however briefly, into these individual lives, that their deaths may have been common, but their lives were unique and individual. And so you will see portraits, little biographies, family photographs, in some cases recordings, brief extracts of interviews we did with friends or family members, talking about the lives as they were lived. You see Mr. Ahmed here, who I chose for a very specific reason. He was a waiter at Windows on the World, an immigrant from Bangladesh. I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but it's important to know that there were no distinctions among the victims, whether they were Americans or not, whatever religions they were. They were targeted because their diversity came together in this place. This was not an accident. The three attacks were targeted on the symbolic center of the American economy, the actual center of the American military, and we believe Flight 93, as I said, was headed towards the center of the American government. So this was well thought out. This was not an accident. This was the idea of people who thought this was a good thing, that the world would be a better place once this had happened. Now, how do we teach this? I want to come back to this photograph because it takes us into the story. One thing we try very hard to do in our educational efforts is take people back to the urgency of the event. How do you do that 15 years later? As was said earlier, in our case, nobody through the age of high school senior actually will have a living memory of 9/11. Within a year or two, nobody at the university level is actually going to remember this. And yet, as we said, this is an event which changed and continues to shape the world that we live in. So how do you get to the heart of the matter here, the urgency of the event? And my own story here ties briefly to this in the sense that I started on this project in May 2005. I'm actually the longest serving person on the 9/11 project. And some of you may have followed the roller coaster ride of what happened. All these projects run into obstacles and difficulties along the way, but we did get to where we've gotten, and as I say, the response has been remarkable. But the most remarkable memory of all of this for me was that first day when the families were invited for the first time. They were the ones who were going to inaugurate the memorial itself. And I would say 10 or 15,000 people were massed at the barriers. And then the barriers were opened, and this flood of humanity came across the Memorial Plaza. First time. Now, this is the North Pool, and I was actually standing at the far end of the North Pool. So I really did have this perspective of this sea of people arriving. And it was a remarkable day because people basically came in family groups, and they set themselves at the name of their loved one. Many families spent the whole day there. As I said before, if you realize that 40% of them had not actually had a physical piece for a funeral or a ceremony, you can understand what the valence of this was. But at that far north end, because it was the furthest away from the point of entry, there was nobody there for a couple of minutes. And then two men came, one in a shalwar kameez, the other younger man in Western clothes. They stopped at the name of Shabir Ahmed, and one of them began praying. And I'm just standing there a little away, just observing this, because other families are beginning to gather, and each one had its own ritual, planting flowers in the name, and so on and so forth. But I saw this, and of course we were in the throes of trying to figure out what it was we were trying to do here, what we were going to accomplish. And I saw this, and I realized that this is just an extraordinary moment of simplicity, but also an extraordinary moment of complexity. And this duality of what 9/11 is, when you think about it, in many ways, it's an extremely simple story. And yet, once you dig a quarter of an inch below the surface, you can go literally anywhere in terms of the human experience. And for me and my colleagues, I don't think each one has had his or her own experience like this. We have never lost the sense that this involves everyone from everywhere. And we know who the perpetrators are, but we also know who the victims are. We know who the first responders are. We know who the residents are. We meet people from these various groups all the time. And it's something that we've had to keep foremost in our thinking, because it allows us to get into the story in a way that doesn't start by pointing fingers. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this issue of the urgency of the event, because how do you teach this? And we are not a school. We are not with the same kids every day, taking them through a curriculum. We see them in a variety of ways that I'll describe shortly. How much time do I have, Tim? Can you tell me?
Okay, about 7 minutes.
7 minutes. I'm not okay. Where does this story begin? Where does it end? We know it doesn't end. We know that 9/11 is a continuing saga. We know our countries have gone to war together over this. We don't know where it's going to end or how it's going to end. Lord West raised some dangerous possibilities about what this might be. So let's put that aside, because we know collectively that we don't know. Let me ask you to think about for a minute, where does the 9/11 story begin? Anybody? If you're teaching it, where do you start? I mean, I do this with teachers and educators, so I sort of know, but I want you to think about it. You have to take this on in a classroom. Many of you perhaps have. Where do you begin the story? You can't begin it on the day, because someone's going to ask you, well, why did they do this? And why did they do this brings you back before 9/11. To spare myself some time, I'm going to give you the backwards trajectory that comes up. So the Soviet-Afghan War, the creation of Israel, colonial movements, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of World War I, the Crusades, and ultimately, in some cases, we get all the way back to the founding of Islam. Where does the world begin? Where does the story begin? Now, in a museum context, we have a problem of space. Any place we decide to start this story, as a starting point, has got to spread logically forward in time and through history. So we would have to explain everything that followed from whatever starting point that you pick. Our selected starting point was, in fact, the Soviet-Afghan War, which was where al-Qaeda emerged and was created as a self-identified group. If you go back earlier, and our first planning had some of that in mind, then you realize, wait a minute, if we're starting in 1920s with the the emerging anti-colonial movements and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, then we have to tell that whole story moving forward. In your classrooms, and here's something that is extraordinarily important, I think. In your classrooms, you have to know enough to fill in that story for students from any point that you begin. And this is really where I've been coming to, because the one thing I realize here, because we see it with the teachers, and our programs have been driven to a really much greater degree than I anticipated, I'm sorry to say. They've been driven by the needs of teachers as defined by teachers in their interactions with us. And the thing that I've realized is how much support teachers need. You think about the challenge that you face here, the reason for this conference, You're on the front line as educators of countering violent extremism. Do you know how to do that? Do you have the tools, the resources, the support from the education system to do that? Our teachers come, pick a starting point for the 9/11 story. Do you know the history onward from that point? Do you have the resources that can make that history clear to students? Do you have the concepts that would allow to talk about politics and theology and economics that can bring you forward? These are essential elements to this, and yet, where are they when the teachers are given the challenge of making this clear and making this real for their students? In our context, and I'm not here to talk to you about your system because I don't know it, but in our context, those resources are not available, nor, frankly, is the support available. But it's not just the intellectual support, it's the emotional support. Because the gap between history and memory is most visible in the classroom. And when I told you before that the teachers have been the ones driving our programs in many ways, it's because it's the teachers who want their young children to learn about 9/11. The teachers are driven by their memory. They understand the impact of the event, the history-changing nature of the event, but the teachers remember where they were. Granted, we're in New York for most of the school groups, so the teachers are local. Many of them have family connections to 9/11, but they are driven by this need to share the event and its impact with their children. But curiously, for the children, it's history. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we avoid upsetting elements for the children. It turns out we needed to focus much more on the upsetting elements of a visit for the teachers. Because as you know, young children, when they're studying history, they don't feel a particular emotional impact of this. Yet the teachers in the same space as the children, they become the more vulnerable ones than these young students. And it's teachers and parents as well. And so you have this inverted dynamic, if you will, of the teachers becoming emotional, the kids not, and the teachers being upset that the kids are not emotional. And so the ways children learn, particularly in a circumstance of history, and it becomes ancient history very quickly, we've learned, they ask questions. And the questions are not necessarily driven by emotion or by the broader picture. They simply would like to know. And that is our starting point. What is it we want to tell them that they want to know? We try to speak as clearly as we possibly can. We focus on a principle that individuals are responsible for what they do. There is no such thing as collective guilt. And we work outward from there. It's an extraordinary thing to see them together in the museum, because these encounters are as much encounters between the teachers and the students as they are between the class and the museum itself. And so, as you think about how you're going to develop this work here and the enormous challenge that you face, from our own experience, I simply urge you to keep in mind that teachers need support to do this work. And support is not just a pat on the back and a shove towards the problem, but support is the resources, the attention, and the understanding of just how big the task is, how much you are asking from teachers to take this on. We will not be done with this anytime soon. This is something that, as you heard, poses significant challenges for us all. But one of the things we talk about as well in the response to 9/11 is an attack on your values is an opportunity to act on those values. And I don't think there's anything that I know that encompasses the values that we share as societies than the value of education, of critical inquiry, and of coming together to solve a collective problem. Thank you very much.
This is great.